Nikolai Gogol was born in 1809 in Sarachinci, in the Poltava governorate of what is today Ukraine, but at the time it was part of the Russian Empire. He died in Moscow in 1852 at the age of 42. Growing up, his family spoke both Ukrainian and Russian. I asked a friend about this, and he told me that somebody who speaks Ukrainian can understand Russian reasonably well, but somebody who only understands Russian will have a harder time understanding Ukrainian. But there is a lot of similarity between the two languages, and they can't really be considered mutually intelligible. But this kind of thing is sort of hard to measure, because if you look at the lexical similarity, this is a count that linguists do about the shared vocabulary and shared usage of words in two languages, so that not only do the words appear in both languages, but they're used in the same way or in a similar way. Because you can sometimes have something strange happen, which is that in two languages, there will be the same word and it's used differently. I had a German friend tell me that in German they call this a false friend, that in the other language they have the same word, but they use it in a different way, so it's actually more confusing. It looks like a friend, but it's not. And in my own experience learning languages, I can say that those kinds of words are definitely harder to learn than just a flat-out new vocabulary word, because your brain is still trying to use it in the old way. And this might be because it's a loan word, often from English, that the meaning changes slightly in the other language. Or it could be that both languages got it from some third language 300 years ago, and over time the usage changed. But anyway, the lexical similarity between Russian and Ukrainian, the number that generally comes up is about 62%. And if you look at the lexical similarity between English and French, for example, the number that comes up is 27%. So you could say, well, Ukrainian and Russian are closer to each other than English and French. In fact, more than twice as close based on this metric. So that's pretty close, except that if you look up the relationship between English and German, it's 60%. And there's obviously a lot of shared vocabulary between English and German, but speaking English will maybe help you learn German a little bit faster, but you won't be able to understand somebody speaking German just because you speak English. You will be able to pick out certain words maybe, but it won't get you very far. So based on what my friend said, there is a closer relationship between Russian and Ukrainian, closer than that between English and German, but it might not be that much closer. But anyway, there's some discussion between Russians and Ukrainians about who can lay claim to Gogol, because on the one hand, he was born in a place that is today called the Ukraine, though again at the time it was part of the Russian Empire, but he wrote in Russian, and he lived a lot of his life in Russia, and he wrote about Russia. And in Dead Souls, as we'll get into, he wrote very passionately about Russia. He wasn't a blind patriot, but he certainly loved the Russian soil, the Russian geography. He loved the land, and he cared a lot about the society. He wanted it to be well, and he was clearly examining and thinking about it a lot. This opens up an interesting question about a person being born and living their childhood, their younger years in one place, and then as an adult going to another and speaking another language more often. What is that person's identity then? From the history of literature, I don't know that this kind of competition matters too much. It's all Europe, though of course many people would say that Russia is closer to Asia than to Europe. That's a whole separate discussion. Or at least that it's its own thing. It's Northern Asia, it's Eurasia. But whether we're going to call Gogol a Ukrainian writer or a Russian writer, he was born in the Ukraine to ethnic Ukrainians. So ethnically he was Ukrainian, but he wrote in Russian and he wrote about Russia. But I would say that doesn't make him Russian. If you take an example like Joseph Conrad, who was also born in Ukraine, which at the time was part of the Russian Empire, but learned English in his 20s and went on to write some really great literature in English. And living in England, you still wouldn't call him an English writer. He's a writer of English, but he's ethnically Polish, I think. So knowing what I know about Gogol, which is not very much, I would characterize him as being a Ukrainian writer who wrote exclusively in Russian and to a great extent about Russia. And you have to say it like that, or something like that. You have to include that information, because if on the one hand you say he was a Ukrainian writer, or if on the other hand you say he was a writer of Russian literature, then that will only be half the picture. And I do think that his origin matters. I don't know how much it matters. Somebody would have to read all of Gogol and also be familiar with both Ukrainian and Russian culture to come up with some picture of how Ukrainian or how Russian was he culturally and in his thinking. But the place where you spend your childhood and your adolescence and your young adulthood, or any portion of your life, that will affect you. And so somebody, a writer who was just born in Moscow and lived their whole life in Moscow, will be a little bit different from somebody who moves there from the outside. And if you read Joseph Conrad, there's nothing in it that seems particularly Polish. In fact, even from his name and from what he's writing about, you might just think this is a British author if you don't go look at his biography. But there is something in Joseph Conrad, in his writing, that's not typical of British writers from that period. And I wouldn't attribute that exclusively to his Polishness, but it might partially be that he's coming at these subjects from a slightly different cultural angle. Anyway, so I managed to immediately get sidetracked with a long thing about language and exactly how to categorize Gogol. But now we can get back to his significance. He's a relatively early Russian writer. There's a quote that often floats around that's usually attributed to Dostoevsky. The quote is, "We all come from Gogol's overcoat." And Overcoat is a short story that Gogol wrote. But it's also suggesting that Russian literature was shaken out of Gogol's sleeve. But it wasn't Dostoevsky who said this, it was a French diplomat and literary critic whose name I'm going to pulverize. I'm not even going to attempt the French pronunciation, but it reads like Eugene Melchior de Vogue. And while there was poetry being written in the late 18th and early 19th century in Russia, Dead Souls, which we're going to be looking at today, is generally thought of as the first great Russian novel. So to a certain extent, these other Russian novelists, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Pushkin, we looked at Turgenev on this podcast, all came after Gogol and Dead Souls. And Gogol viewed this work as a, quote, epic poem in prose, end quote. And he sometimes references this poem while he's writing. In the novel, he says, we won't be using foreign language words in this poem. Even though it's a novel, he refers to it as a poem. And some people have compared it to Dante, to the Divine Comedy. And there is even one overt reference to Dante. He's in a government office trying to navigate the bureaucracy, and somebody's taking him from one room to another, and he says this other guy was Virgil to the main character's Dante, that he was leading him into hell, essentially. And I see how people could make that comparison on the whole, and it's worth mentioning that the Divine Comedy is also a poem, or is rather actually a poem. But the main premise of the story, and this isn't giving too much away, is that this guy, Chichikov, is going around Russia trying to buy up dead souls. In Russia at the time, there are still serfs. Serfdom wasn't abolished until 1861, and landowners have to pay a tax on how many serfs they have, but the tax is based on a census that's done every so many years. And in between the two censuses, if you're a wealthy landowner, you might have 1,000 serfs, and some of them might die in between the two censuses. But you have to keep paying taxes on them because the census still shows that they're alive. At the next census, you can count how many you have, and then you only have to pay taxes on those. And Chichikov is going around Russia trying to buy up these dead souls. Oh, and souls is a word, it must sound a little bit more natural in Russian, but it's sort of a unit of quantity for the serfs. They say there are 30 souls of serfs on this piece of land. And he has a reason why he's doing this, and it takes a while for it to be revealed. But that's the premise. But what it's really about is him going across Russia and meeting all kinds of people. And this is what's really effective about the story. And it's a very enjoyable read. Sometimes when you're reading a book, there will be parts that drag a little and you push through because you know it'll pick up again. This book I found to be interesting and engaging from beginning to end. And there are at least two things that could have been working against it, that could have made it more difficult to read. And One is that it is largely about Russia in the early 19th century. It's about a very particular time period. And he's going around talking to these people in small towns across Russia. Most of the people that he talks to are upper class people because he's trying to buy serfs, and the only people who own serfs are upper class people. But it could have been very provincial. And I'm sure that if you're Russian and you read it in Russian, there's all kinds of other subtleties about the sorts of phrases that the people use, and maybe he imitates their accents or just their local speech. But the different types of people that he encounters, I can't say that they're universal because I don't know if they have these kinds of people in Japan or somewhere else that I haven't been to. But as an American reader, the different types of people seem very familiar, and he depicts them and describes them in very interesting detail. And you could imagine that a book like this might come out with too many inside jokes with the guy at the corner store for it to be good in translation, but it's not like that at all. It's very easy to imagine a version of this story in 1842 in America, or even in 2022, because human nature doesn't change very much. And while it would be hard to list the different types of people that there could possibly be, people do end up at certain points in life. They end up in a certain position because of a certain characteristic that they have. And that mechanism is fairly universal. And there are identifiable patterns in how it plays out. And another thing that he talks about a lot is the corruption in the government at the time. And I would discourage a reader from looking at this and saying, oh, Russia is so corrupt, and it was back then too. It would be hard to get a measurement of this, but I'm not sure that the French government in 1842 was significantly less corrupt. The kind of corruption that he's describing is a pretty straightforward kind where when you want to get something to happen in the bureaucracy, you have to pay certain people off, and that's just part of what makes the wheels turn. Rather than describing something unusual about Russia, it might be that Gogol was unusually honest in depicting this. And he even addresses at one point readers who will say, what will the foreigners think? You're describing all these bad things, you're making us look bad, and the foreigners are going to read this. And so he's aware of that dynamic. But rather than describing something that doesn't exist in other places, I think he is just very self-reflective and very interested in the success and health of Russian society and government, and so he wants to talk about this issue. And what this reminds me of, in part, is that if you look at the Turkish press, the modern Turkish press talking about America, and I know this because I speak Turkish, what will often happen is they will take a news piece, an article, a bit of research from American media, for instance, talking about bullying in schools, that finds such and such number of children are bullied in schools, and what should we do about this? This is a problem. And the Turkish media will say, look, this many kids are bullied in American schools. Isn't that terrible? Our schools are so much better. Or they won't say the last part, but it's kind of implied because by publishing this sort of bad or slightly unpleasant news about America, they can pull down a little bit this country that they, I think, have a little bit of an inferiority complex about. But that isn't because there's no bullying in Turkish schools. There just isn't any research about it. So the absence of self-reflection in that case becomes a source of pride. And when we're looking at Gogol, we should be careful not to do the same thing. And the other structural reason why this novel could have been more difficult to read than it was, the first being that on the surface it deals with topics that maybe look a little more provincial, a little bit more localized, but in fact are quite universal. The other challenge about this novel is that it's unfinished. It was going to be in 3 parts. It's basically 1 part and a little bit more. Gogol burned the manuscript of the second part shortly before he died. And when you're reading it, toward the end, you get to sections and it says several pages are apparently missing here. And the story starts to fray a little bit. There are references to something that you haven't read about yet, which implies that that was in some section that had been removed. But about the first 95% of the novel reads beautifully. And then it ends mid-sentence. And some people think that it, in fact, is in its final state. This is how Gogol wanted it to be. I think that's a little bit of a reach. but it is definitely still satisfying and interesting to read despite being unfinished. But I definitely could have read 2 more volumes or another volume and a half of similar material. I would have loved to have seen that. But the book can definitely be categorized as satire, not only political criticism, but social criticism, making fun of certain behaviors of people. There's a long passage about gossip and how it spreads and expands, and how it spreads differently among different groups of people, that the ordinary townspeople are very susceptible to adding stuff to something that they heard, and something that starts out as speculation ends up as utterly proven fact. But there's also a police investigation going on around that time, and he talks about the way that the police apparatus, the information moving in it, how it sort of expands also. And I think one of the things that makes this book so easy to read is that it's quite funny. It's sometimes almost absurd. I mean, the premise is a little bit absurd, buying dead souls, and it's also sort of grim, but plenty of the descriptions and the situations are quite funny. It also has very detailed depictions of bribery and corruption, and these are relatively early in the history of literature. There maybe are earlier examples of people talking sort of with a wink about corruption, but in this book there are long scenes where people are talking about who you have to pay and how. And at one point he's complaining about how under the old system it was very easy, you knew who you had to pay and you'd be done with it, but now that there's been some improvements to try to get the corruption under control, it's more complicated now to do the bribery, but it's still done, and you have to pay more people and you have to pay them more. And he grumbles about that. He says, I wish it was how it used to be. There's a lot of discussion about social status, about the hierarchy of classes, who's above whom, and what shows them to be so. How do they act? How do they act toward each other? But now we can get into some passages from Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. He writes, quote, "It must be said that if we in Russia have not caught up foreigners in other things, we have far outstripped them in the knowledge of how to behave. All the shades and subtleties of our manners cannot be counted. A Frenchman or a German would never catch and understand all its peculiarities and distinctions. He will speak in almost the same tone of voice and almost the same language to a millionaire and to a little tobacconist, though of course in his soul he will grovel quite sufficiently before the former. It is not so with us. There are among us persons so clever that they can talk to a landowner with 200 souls quite differently from the way in which they speak to one with 300, and to the one with 300 they will speak differently again from the manner in which they will address one with 500, and to one with 500 they do not talk as they do to one with 800. In short, there are shades all up to 1,000,000. Let us suppose, for instance, that there is a government office, not here, but in some fairy kingdom, and let us suppose that in the office there is a head of the office. I beg you to look at him when he is sitting among his subordinates. One is simply too awe-stricken to utter a word. Pride and dignity, and what else is not expressed upon his face? You should take a brush and paint him. A Prometheus, a perfect Prometheus. He looks like an eagle. He moves with a measured step. That very eagle, when he has left his own room and is approaching the sanctum of his chief, flutters along like a partridge with papers under his arm as best he may. In company and at an evening party, if all present are of a low rank, Prometheus remains Prometheus. But if they are ever so little above him, Prometheus undergoes a metamorphosis such as Ovid never imagined. He is a fly, less than a fly indeed. He humbles himself into the dust. But this isn't Ivan Petrovich, you say, looking at him. Ivan Petrovich is taller, and this fellow is both short and thin. Ivan Petrovich talks in a loud bass voice and never laughs, while there is no making this fellow out. He pipes like a bird and keeps laughing. You go near, you look. It really is Ivan Petrovich." End quote. This is a perfect example of the kind of descriptions I'm talking about. And who hasn't met somebody like that? That they're authoritarian among people who are their subordinates in some situation, and then cringing among people who are above them in the same hierarchy. And you notice he's trying to dodge some censorship or some problems. He says, imagine a government office, not here, but in some fairy kingdom. He's saying, I'm not saying this about our government. I'm saying it about some imaginary hypothetical thing. And I think he's doing that to avoid legal problems later, but it's obvious what he means. And one of the things that's fun about this novel is that he's often talking to the reader. The narrator will turn and talk to you about something, and then he'll say, well, we better get back to the story, and then he'll go back. So it's a little informal. And sometimes he doesn't only talk to the reader, who he maybe imagines is sort of sympathetic to what he's saying, but he's talking to all the people that he anticipates are going to be mad about something that he's saying. And he doesn't do it so often that it's disruptive, but he tries to preempt some of the objections. And that's also interesting. It's kind of like he's writing a novel, standing on a chair in a bar, and there's a rowdy group of people around him who keep heckling him about something, and he's shouting them down. It's a very accessible tone that I wasn't expecting. And in this next passage, he's talking about a character, but for our purposes here, it doesn't matter who or what the context is. Gogol writes, quote, "Is there really such a vast chasm separating her from her sister, who, inaccessibly immured within the walls of her aristocratic house with its perfumed cast-iron staircases, its shining copper fittings, its mahogany and carpets, yawns over her unfinished book while she waits to pay her visits in witty fashionable society? There she has a field in which to display her intelligence and express the views she has learned by heart. Not ideas of her own, about her household and her estate, both neglected and in disorder thanks to her ignorance of housekeeping and farming, but those opinions that by fashion's decree interest the town for a whole week, ideas about the political revolution brewing in France and the tendencies of fashionable Catholicism." End quote. Who doesn't know somebody like that? Most people are like that. They yawn over an unfinished book. They can't keep up with the book that they're reading, if they try to read a book at all. And then she has memorized ideas that come from outside, and they are fashionable for a week. Everybody's talking about them for a week. It's fashion's decree, he says. But also, they're not her own ideas, and they don't have to do with her own life. Not ideas of her own about her household and her estate, both neglected and in disorder thanks to her ignorance of housekeeping and farming. She's not tending to her actual life and learning things about it and learning about how to do whatever in her garden or whatever it might be, learning things that are functional and developing her own ideas about how to do it. She's just absorbing this collection of ideas that she can use to display her intelligence in witty fashionable society. This next one is a bit longer, and the context is that on the road going somewhere, another cart stops and he sees a beautiful young woman in the other cart, and he and the other men who are there are talking and doing something for a while, and then eventually they separate. So that's the context. Gogol writes, quote, "While all this was going on, Chichikov looked very attentively at the young lady in the carriage. Several times he made an effort to speak to her, but he somehow could not bring himself to do so. And meanwhile the ladies drove off. The pretty little head together with the delicate features and the slender waist vanished almost like a vision. And there remained only the road, the chaise, the 3 horses with whom the reader is familiar, Selifan, Chichikov, the desolate flatness of the surrounding fields. Everywhere in life, wherever it may be, among the coarse, cruelly poor, and dirtily squalid lower ranks, or among the monotonously frigid and tediously decorous higher orders, in every class a man is met at least once in his life by an apparition unlike anything that it has been his lot to see before, which for once awakens in him a feeling unlike what he is destined to feel all his life. In every life, joy flashes gay and radiant across the sorrows of all sorts of which the web of our life is woven, just as sometimes a splendid carriage with glittering harness, picturesque horses, and windows flashing in the light suddenly darts by some poor squalid little village, which has till then seen naught but rustic carts, and long afterwards the peasants stand, hat in hand, gaping with open mouths, though the wonderful carriage has long since whirled by and vanished out of sight. Just in the same way this fair young lady has appeared utterly unexpectedly in our story and vanished again. Had some boy of 20 been in Chichikov's place, a hussar, a student, or simply a young man beginning his career in life, my God, what would not have awakened, what would not have stirred, what would not have spoken in his heart? For long minutes he would have stood bewildered on the spot, gazing vacantly into the distance, forgetting the road and the reproofs and the chidings that await him for his delay, forgetting himself, his duty, the world, and everything in it. But our hero was a man of mature years and of a cool and calculating temper. He too grew pensive and reflective, but more practically. His reflections were not so irresponsible, but were, one may say, very much to the point. "A fine wench," he said, opening his snuff-box and taking a pinch of snuff. "But what is it that is especially fine in her?" End quote. There are a couple different things going on there. One is this nice description of something that can happen in life, which is that you have this fleeting glimpse of something beautiful. Maybe it's a woman, maybe it's a cozy looking house that you see on a road that you're driving on. Maybe it's an interesting profession that you hadn't thought about before or didn't know existed, and it can really affect you. But then he also talks about the difference between how a young man might respond to something like that and how Chichikov does. He's clearly kind of an anti-hero, and here his middle age and maybe a little bit of his jadedness is shown in a very particular way. And in a couple of passages, he discusses more openly the choice of Chichikov as a main character. He writes, quote, "Happy the writer who, passing by tedious and repulsive characters that impress us by their painful reality, attaches himself to characters that display the loftiest virtues of humanity, who, from the great whirlpool of human figures flitting by him daily, has selected only the few exceptions, who has never tuned his lyre to a less exalted key, has never stooped from his pinnacle to his poor, insignificant fellow creatures, but without touching the earth has devoted himself entirely to his elevated images that are utterly remote from it. His fair portion is doubly worthy of envy. He lives in the midst of them as in the midst of his own family, and at the same time his fame resounds far and wide. He clouds men's vision with enchanting incense, he flatters them marvelously, covering up the gloomy side of life and exhibiting to them the noble man. All run after him, clapping their hands and eagerly following his triumphal chariot. They call him a great world-famed poet, soaring high above every other genius as the eagle soars above the other birds of the air. Young, ardent hearts are thrilled at his very name, responsive tears gleam in every eye." Skipping ahead, "No one is equal in power, he is a god, but quite other is the portion, and very different is the destiny of the writer who has the temerity to bring to the surface what is ever before men's sight, and is unseen by their indifferent eyes. All the terrible overwhelming mire of trivialities in which our life is entangled, all that is hidden in the often cold, petty, everyday characters with which our bitter and dreary path through life swarms, and with the strong hand of a relentless sculptor dares to present them bold and distinct to the gaze of all. It is not for him to receive the applause of the people. It is not his lot to behold the grateful tears and single-hearted rapture of souls stirred by his words. No girl of 16 with her head turned flies to meet him with heroic enthusiasm. It is not his lot to lose himself in the sweet enchantment of sounds he has himself evoked. And lastly, it is not his lot to escape the contemporary critic, the hypocritical, callous contemporary critic who will call his cherished creations mean and insignificant, will assign him an ignoble place in the ranks of writers who have insulted humanity, will attribute to him the qualities of his heroes, will strip him of heart and soul and the divine fire of talent. For the contemporary critic does not recognize that the telescope through which we behold the sun and the microscope which unfolds to us the movements of unnoticed insects are equally marvelous. For the contemporary critic does not recognize that great spiritual depth is needed to light up a picture of ignoble life and transform it into a gem of creative art. For the contemporary critic does not admit that the laughter of lofty delight is worthy to stand beside exalted lyrical emotion, and that there is all the world of difference between it and the antics of clowns at a fair. All this the critic of today does not admit, and he will turn it all into the censure and dishonor of the unrecognized writer. Without sympathy, without response, without compassion, he is left by the roadside like the traveler without a family. Hard is his lot, and bitterly he feels his loneliness. And for long years to come I am destined by some strange fate to walk hand in hand with my odd heroes, to gaze at life in its vast movement, to gaze upon it through laughter seen by the world and tears unseen and unknown by it. And far away still is the time when the terrible storm of inspiration will burst into another stream, and my head be wreathed with holy terror and brilliance, and men will hear with a confused tremor the majestic thunder of other words. Skipping ahead. But forward, forward. Away with the wrinkles that furrow the brow, away with stern and gloomy looks, let us plunge at once into life with all its silent clamor and jingling bells, and let us see what Chichikov is doing." End quote. And there are a couple of passages like that in the book. But there we can see, in part, some of Gogol's philosophy of writing. He says that writers who deal with virtuous characters get a lot of praise and everybody likes them. They have a two-sided benefit. One is that they get to spend their time thinking about good people and virtues and whatever. And then also the crowd likes them. People like them. People praise them. They see them as great poets or whatever. And he gives this really nice description about talking about writing about life as it actually is. And if you do that, which is what Gogol is doing, people think that you have the characteristics of these nasty characters that you're writing, and they don't understand that doing that kind of writing is important and difficult also, and so it's a lonely lifestyle. And what he's talking about is the beginning of what we would today call literary realism. And Dickens is often credited as a very early realist writer, and he published the Pickwick Papers, which is his first novel, in 1836. Which is only a few years before this, and Honoré de Balzac is also considered a very early realist writer. He's writing around this time. So Gogol is doing something similar around the same time. I'm not sure that he had read anything by Balzac or Dickens, but this is a trend that existed, and he was doing it in Russian. He later writes, quote, "I beg your pardon. I believe an expression overheard in the street has just escaped from the lips of my hero. I could not help it. Such is the sad plight of an author in Russia. Though indeed, if a word overheard in the streets does creep into a book, it is not the author who is to blame, but the readers, and especially the readers of the best society. It is from them, above all others, that you never hear a decent Russian word. But they must reel off French, German, and English phrases beyond anything you could wish for, and they even keep to every possible pronunciation. French they speak through their nose with a lisp. English they twitter like a bird in the correct way, and even look like birds as they speak it, and positively laugh at those who cannot make their faces look like birds. They never contribute anything Russian. At most, their patriotism leads them to build a peasant's hut in the Russian style for a summer bungalow. So that's what readers of the best society are like, and all who rank themselves as such follow their example. And at the same time, how exacting they are. They insist that everything must be written in the most rigidly correct language, purified and refined. In fact, they want the Russian language to descend of itself from the clouds, all finished and polished, and settle on their tongue, leaving them nothing to do but open their mouth and stick it out." End quote. This is a topic that Gogol addresses a few times in the novel, is the use of non-Russian phrases in Russian. The upper classes speaking French and also using French phrases in their daily life, even when they're speaking Russian. And he opposes this, as you can see here. And I do think this is a very bad practice in any language. The example that comes to mind is that if you listen to educated Pakistanis or anyone living in the United States, but even journalists, if you listen to a broadcast in Pakistan, to a debate or something, even if you don't speak Urdu, you can listen and you'll be able to hear certain things because they'll suddenly say a half of a sentence in English, or they'll say one word in English, or they'll slide into English for 2 sentences and then they'll go back to Urdu. And to a much lesser extent, Turks do this. But they'll just use one word maybe. This is sometimes called Plaza English in Turkish. Using an English word where there's a perfectly serviceable Turkish word available, and you're using the English word just to show off a little bit. And it's more often done, I find, by people who are not fluent enough in English to just speak English all the way through, but they know a few words, so they're going to sprinkle those in wherever they can. And I'm not talking about words that have settled in the language over the course of 100 years. I'm talking about words that an ordinary speaker of the language would not know unless they know English. I think this mixing of languages in this way is not good. I think if you're speaking French, speak French. If you're speaking English, speak English. If you're speaking Turkish, speak Turkish. If you're speaking Russian, speak Russian. If you have a good reason to use a word from a different language that's very suitable and there isn't an equivalent in the language that you're using, you might do that. And you might explain what the word is, and so that the word can maybe be used in the language that you're speaking. But that's different. And on a related cultural topic, Gogol writes, after Chichikov has been to a ball and it went badly for him, quote, "There was an unpleasant, confused feeling in his heart. There was an oppressive emptiness in it. Damnation take all those who arranged that ball," he said to himself in anger. What were they so pleased about in their foolishness? The crops have failed and there is dearth in the province, and here they are all for balls. A fine business. They dress themselves up in their feminine rags. It's a monstrous thing for a woman to waste 1,000 rubles on her trappings. And of course, it's at the expense of the peasant's earnings, or what's worse still, of the consciences of our dear friends. We all know why a man takes a bribe and overcomes his scruples. It's to get his wife a shawl or robes of some sort. Plague take them, whatever they are called. And what for? That some low woman shouldn't say that the postmaster's wife was better dressed, and bang goes 1,000 rubles because of her. They cry out, a ball, delightful. A ball's a silly, rubbishy thing. It's not in the Russian spirit, nor true to the Russian nature. What the devil is one to make of it? A grown-up man getting on in years suddenly skips in all in black, as trim and tight as a devil, and sets to working away with his legs. Even while they are standing in couples, a man will begin talking to another about something of importance, and all the while his legs will be capering to right and to left like a goat. Skipping ahead. It is all apishness, because a Frenchman is as childish at 40 as he was at 15, we must be the same. Yes, really, after every ball one feels as though one had committed a sin and does not like to think of it. One's head is as empty as it is after talking to one of these society gentlemen. He talks about everything, touches lightly on everything. He says everything he has filched out of books brightly and picturesquely, but he hasn't got anything of it in his head. And you see afterwards that a talk with a humble merchant who knows nothing but his own business, but does know that thoroughly and by experience, is better than all these chatterboxes. Why, what do you get out of this ball? Come, suppose some writer were to take it into his head to describe all that scene just as it was. Why, it would be just as senseless in a book as it is in nature. What was it, moral or immoral? God knows what to make of it. You would simply spit and shut the book. Such were Chichikov's unfavorable criticisms of balls in general. But I fancy that there was partly another reason for his indignation. His chief vexation was not with the ball, but with the fact that he had happened to come off rather badly at it, that he had been made to look like goodness knows what, that he had played a strange and ambiguous part at it. Of course, looking at it as a sensible man, he could see that it was all nonsense, that a foolish word is of no consequence, especially now when his chief business was successfully concluded. But, strange as man, he was deeply mortified at being in disfavor with the very people whom he did not respect, and whose vanity and love of dress he derided." End quote. So this ball goes badly for him, and then he goes on a long tirade about how stupid balls are. And I think this is in part Gogol's view. It's a waste of money. You have to tax the serfs in order to pay for it. It's undignified. But the most interesting part is that he names it as French. It becomes a national issue. That the ball is a French practice that the Russians imported, and that it's not suitable for Russians. And he gives another example of the value of somebody knowing something from experience. We saw earlier he was talking about the woman who she doesn't know anything about farming or housekeeping because she doesn't pay any attention to those actual things that affect her life. And here he gave the example of the merchant who maybe he can't talk about a bunch of different subjects, but he knows his job, he knows the trade that he deals in, and he knows it from experience, which is better than to be able to just talk fashionably. And then he winds it back to this human thing that the real reason why he's mad about balls is that he didn't look good at the ball. And ironically, he's upset that he doesn't have the favor of these people that he's now mocking. He's deriding them. And this next section also deals with the topic of language that we were looking at earlier. Quote, "I may as well mention that the ladies introduced many foreign words into their conversation, and sometimes whole French sentences. But great as is the author's reverence for the inestimable benefits conferred by the French language on Russia, and great as is his respect for the praiseworthy custom in our aristocratic society of expressing themselves at all hours in that language, entirely, of course, through their love of the fatherland, yet he cannot bring himself to introduce sentences in any foreign languages into this Russian poem. And so, we will continue in Russian." End quote. And that's, of course, sarcastic. He says that the aristocracy express themselves at all hours in French out of love for the fatherland, which of course doesn't make any sense. This next passage is also a pretty funny description. Quote, "In the council assembled on this occasion, there was a conspicuous absence of that essential thing which among the common people is called good sense. We seem somehow not made for representative institutions. In all our assemblies, from the meetings of the peasants up to all kinds of learned and other committees, there is a pretty thorough muddle, unless there is someone at the head who is managing it all. It is hard to say why it is. Apparently, the nature of the Russian people is such that the only successful committees are those formed to arrange entertainments or dinners such as clubs or pleasure gardens in the German style. Yet we are always ready at any minute for anything. We fly like the wind to get up benevolent and philanthropic societies and goodness knows what. The aim may be excellent, but nothing ever comes of it. Perhaps it is because we are satisfied at the very beginning and consider everything has already been done. For instance, after organizing a society for the benefit of the poor and subscribing a considerable sum, we immediately spend half of the funds subscribed on giving a dinner to all the worthies of the town in celebration of our laudable enterprise. With what is left of our funds, we promptly take a grand house with heating arrangements and porters for the use of the committee, after which 5 rubles and a half is all that is left for the poor, and over the distribution of that sum the members of the committee cannot agree, each one urging the claims of some crony of his own." End quote. And before this next one, something has happened, it doesn't really matter what, but then he starts out by speaking as if the readers are speaking to him. So the first thing here is the readers are reacting to something that just happened. Quote, "But this is absurd, though. It's out of the question. It's impossible that officials could scare themselves so, could make up such nonsense, could stray so far from the truth when a child could have seen through it. Many readers will say this, and will blame the author for improbability, or will call the poor officials fools, for a man is lavish in the use of the word fool, and is ready to apply it to his neighbor 20 times a day. It is quite enough if out of 10 points in his character he has one stupid one, for him to be set down as a fool in spite of his 9 good points." It is easy for readers to criticize, looking down from their comfortable niche on the heights from which the whole horizon lies open, at all that is taking place below, where man can only see the object nearest to him. And in the history of humanity there are many whole centuries which he would, I fancy, strike out and suppress as unnecessary. Many mistakes have been made in the world which now one would hardly think a child could make. How many crooked, narrow, impassable, blind alleys leading far off the track has mankind chosen in the effort to reach the eternal verity, while before him the straight road lay open like the road that leads to a magnificent mansion destined to be a royal palace. It is broader and more splendid than all the other paths, with the sun lighting it up by day and many lights by night. But men have streamed past it in blind darkness. And how many times, even when guided by understanding that has been given them from heaven, they have managed even then to halt and go astray, have managed in the light of day to get into the impassable jungle, have managed to throw a blinding fog again over one another's eyes, and lured by will-o'-the-wisps have succeeded in reaching the brink of the abyss, only to ask one another with horror, where is the way out? Where is the road? The present generation sees everything clearly, marvels at the errors and laughs at the follies of its forefathers, not seeing that there are streaks of heavenly light in that history, that every letter in it cries aloud to them, that on all sides a pointing finger is turned upon it upon the present generation. But the present generation laughs and proudly, self-confidently enters upon a series of fresh errors at which their descendants will laugh again in their turn." End quote. That's a nice passage describing human folly in general, and how, while you're reading something, you imagine there's no way people could be that dumb. But the reason is because you're not in it. You're not in that situation. When you're looking at it from the outside, you can see that it's dumb. But when you're in it, it's not obvious what's going on. And then he says that history is like that. The current generation will look back at history and go, oh, that was dumb, this was dumb. And even while they're saying that, they are doing things that future generations will say was dumb. And that's not because of a human failing exactly. It's not because one generation is more dumb than another. It's a problem of perspective, that you can't see what's going on from inside of it. You need a vantage point from outside to see clearly what's going on. And having some distance in time can provide that vantage point. Gogol writes, quote, "The author confesses that he is glad of the opportunity of talking a little about his hero, for hitherto he has always been hindered from doing so, either by Nozdryov, or by balls, or by ladies, or by the scandal of the town, in short, by the 1,001 trivialities which only seem trivialities when they are brought into a book, while in the world they pass for very important matters." End quote. And just a quick note here, there again, he's referencing this difference in perspective, that when you're in something it seems very important, and then you're looking at it from the outside in a book, it seems like a triviality. Continuing from the same spot, quote, "But now we will lay aside everything else and go straight to the point. It is very doubtful whether the reader will like the hero we have selected. That he will not please the ladies one may say with certainty, for ladies insist on a hero's being absolute perfection, and if he has some tiny spiritual or physical blemish, then there's trouble. However deeply the author gazes into his soul, and though he may reflect it more clearly than a mirror, they will give him no credit for it. Chichikov's very stoutness and middle age will do him great damage in their eyes. They will never forgive stoutness in a hero under any circumstances, and very many ladies will turn away, saying, 'Fie, what a horrid man!' Alas, the author is very well aware of this, and yet he cannot take a virtuous man for his hero." Skipping ahead, "It is high time at last to let the poor virtuous man rest, because the phrase virtuous man is too often taken in vain, because they have made a regular hack of the virtuous man, and there is not a writer who has not ridden him to death, lashing him on with whip or anything that comes to hand, because they have so overdone the virtuous man that there is not a shadow of virtue left about him, and he is nothing but skin and bone, because it is through hypocrisy they invoke the virtuous man, because the virtuous man is not respected. No, the time has come at last to trot out the rascal, and so let us trot out the rascal." End quote. That's a bit more explaining what he's doing by choosing Chichikov as a hero. And in another passage later he writes, quote, "And so here we have the full-length portrait of our hero, just as he was. But perhaps the reader will insist on a definite answer in regard to one particular. What sort of man was he as regards moral qualities? That he was not a hero filled with virtues and perfections is evident. What was he then? He must have been a scoundrel, I suppose. Why a scoundrel? Why be so severe to others? There are no scoundrels among us nowadays. There are well-intentioned, agreeable people. But you will scarcely find above 2 or 3 men who would risk the public ignominy of a slap in the face, and even those talk about virtue nowadays. It would be more just to call him a good manager, a man bent on making money. Making money is the universal vice. Things have been done which the world describes as not very honest for the sake of it. It is true that there is something repellent in such a character, and the very readers who on their way through life would make friends with such a man, would entertain him in their house and spend their time agreeably with him, look at him askance if he is made the hero of a drama or poem. But wise is he who does not disdain any character, but probing it with searching eye investigates its primary elements. Everything is rapidly transformed in a man. Before you have time to look round, a terrible worm has grown up within him, and is sucking all his vital sap. And more than once some passion, not merely a great passion but some insignificant little propensity for something petty, has sprung up in a man born for better things, has made him forget great and sacred duties and see something great and holy in insignificant baubles. Innumerable as the sands of the sea are the passions of man, and all are different, and all base and noble alike are first under a man's control, and afterwards cruel tyrants dominating him. Blessed is the man who has chosen from among them a noble passion. It grows, and with every hour and minute increases his immense happiness, and he enters further and further into the infinite paradise of his soul. Skipping ahead. But what weighs upon me is not that my readers will be displeased with my hero. What weighs upon me is the conviction which nothing can shake in my soul that my readers would have been delighted with the same hero, this same Chichikov, if the author had not looked too deeply into his soul, had not stirred up in its depths what slips away and hides from the light, had not displayed the most secret thoughts which a man does not trust to any other, but had shown him such as he appeared to all the town, to Manilov and others. Then everyone would have been delighted with him, and would have welcomed him as an interesting man. It would not have mattered that neither his face nor his whole figure would have moved as though living before their eyes. On the other hand, when they had finished the book, their souls would have been untroubled, and they could go back to the card table, which is the solace of all Russia. Yes, my gentle readers, you would rather not see the poverty of human nature exposed. Skipping ahead. The author will incur censure also from the so-called patriots who as a rule sit quietly at home and busy themselves about quite other matters, making money, making their fortunes at the expense of others. But as soon as anything happens which they regard as insulting to their country, if a book appears in which some bitter truth is told, they run out of every corner like spiders when they see a fly caught in their web and immediately raise outcries. Is it right to bring such a thing to light, to proclaim it aloud? Why, all the things that are described here are private affairs. Is it right? What will foreigners say? Is it pleasant to hear a low opinion of oneself? Do they imagine that it isn't painful? Do they imagine that we are not patriots? I must confess that I cannot find a fitting answer to these sage observations, especially the one concerning the opinion of foreigners. Skipping ahead. You even laugh heartily at Chichikov. Perhaps you will even praise the author, and will say, "He has neatly hit it off, though. He must be an amusing fellow." And after saying that, you look at yourself with redoubled pride. A self-satisfied smile comes onto your face, and you add, "There is no denying that there are very queer and funny people in some provinces, and thorough rogues, too. And which of you, full of Christian meekness, not in public, but alone in private, at the moment of solitary inward converse, asks in the depths of your own soul this painful question, is there not a bit of Chichikov in me, too?" End quote. That passage makes me think of that Jonathan Swift quote about satire, that satire is a looking glass in which the viewer sees everyone but himself. There Gogol was in part talking about how Chichikov got to be how he is, that we have all these passions and appetites that at first it looks like we're in control of them, but then they're in control of us. And the big one is the passion for making money. But most of all, when you're reading this book, Gogol says to not do the thing that I started out this podcast by saying, which is to say, oh, isn't it interesting, all of these different weirdos that there are in the world? And this guy really described them well. Isn't that funny? He said, can you really imagine that there might be some Chichikov in you? And also, while I was reading that passage just now, I thought about what makes this kind of realism a little different. A lot of times people associate realism with showing the poor, that a lot of older novels, older stories, whether you're talking about Homer or Shakespeare or any number of other writers or stories, what you're usually talking about is the affairs of the gods. What are the gods doing? How are they messing with each other? Or legendary figures, or noblemen. What are the kings doing? What are the princes doing? And it was a relatively new innovation in the 18th and 19th centuries to start talking about poor people. But while in a strange way the serfs are almost a main character of Dead Souls, in fact they are the titular character, and they're in a way even being abused in their death. This swindler is taking advantage of them even in their death. Gogol doesn't talk about the serfs very much as characters. Turgenev, in another episode of this podcast we looked at Sportsman's Notebook, talks a lot more about the Russian serfs and what their lives are like and how they talk and what they say. Gogol has less of that. Here, the serfs are more of a commodity. So the realism that Gogol is presenting is not depicting financial poverty, but depicting what he calls the poverty of human nature. He's not talking about the lives of poor people, but he's talking about the lives of people who are poor in their morality. And this is a kind of realism also. Not everyone is rich and owns a castle, and not everyone is super virtuous and upright. And he very deliberately, as we've seen that he says at several points in this book, wanted to depict that aspect of life. And he, of course, did it so well that close to 200 years later, we are still enjoying and discussing and examining it. There was another passage I wanted to read, but I ended up cutting it, but it's a funny depiction of a guy, a colonel, I think, who's part of a bureaucracy. And all through the book, Chichikov is going to different governments because every time he needs to make a deal where he's bought some souls from somebody, he has to then go get the purchase approved and registered and approved by the local government, and that often involves some bribery. And one of the government officials that he encounters is this guy who wants everything down on paper, and he has all kinds of committees in his government, and you have to go over here to talk to this guy, and that committee is connected to this committee, and it seems all very organized. And then when Chichikov goes to talk to the committees, he finds that essentially there's nothing there. And then when he goes and tells the guy, he says, hey, all your committees don't really exist, or they're not doing what you think they're doing. And then the guy sets up another committee to investigate the committees. It's a whole thing. And that guy has floor-to-ceiling books in a library in his house on all kinds of different subjects about philosophy and pig farming and all kinds of things. And he's a guy who, in practice, can't make anything happen. He's rather incompetent or impotent, even in his little corner of the bureaucracy. And this, again, this is now the third example, even just in the passages that we looked at. Gogol is making fun of this type of person who purports to be learned, but can't actually do anything. And he praises the reverse, which is somebody who actually has an applicable skill in some area that they know from experience, and maybe they can't talk in a very learned way, but they can make something happen. So that's a clear, repeating thought in his writing. And Chichikov, talking about that colonel, there's just one little sentence. He calls him a fool and a silly ass, and he says, quote, he has rummaged about in books, but what has he learned? End quote. So let's not be like that. Books are important. It's good to read books. It's good to own books. But you should ask, what have you learned? And also, what can you actually do in practice with your learning? And this next one is a nice passage describing farming. Quote, if you want to grow rich quickly, Skudrinzolo caught him up suddenly and abruptly, for he was still full of ill humor. You'll never get rich at all. If you want to get rich without caring how long it takes, you'll get rich quickly. You don't say so, said Chichikov. Yes, said Skudrinzolo abruptly, as though he had been angry with Chichikov himself. You must have a love for the work. Without that, you can do nothing. You must like farming. Yes, and believe me, it is anything but dull. They have got up an idea that it is depressing in the country, but I should die of depression if I had to spend one day in town as they spend their time. A farmer has no time to be bored. There is no emptiness in his life. It is all fullness. You have only to look at the varied round of the year's work. And what work? Work that does truly elevate the spirit, to say nothing of its variety. In it a man goes hand in hand with nature, with the seasons of the year, and is in touch and in sympathy with everything that is done in creation. Before the spring is here, our labors are already beginning. There is carting and getting in timber, and while the roads are impassable, there is the getting ready the seed, the sifting and measuring of the corn in the granaries, and the drying of it and distributing the tasks among the peasants. As soon as the snows and floods are over, work begins in earnest. By the river there is loading the boats, then there is thinning trees in the wood and planting trees in the garden, and in every direction the men are turning up the ground. The spade is at work in the vegetable garden, the plows and harrows in the fields, and the sowing begins. That's a trifling matter, of course. They are sowing the future harvest. When summer has come, there is the mowing, the husbandman's first holiday. That's a trifling matter, too. One harvest comes after the other. After the rye, the wheat, after the barley, the oats, and then the pulling of the hemp. They throw the hay into cocks, they build the stacks. And when August is half over, there is the carting of it all to the threshing barns. Autumn comes, there is the plowing and the sowing of the winter corn, the repair of the granaries, the barns and the cattle sheds, sampling the corn and the first threshing. Winter comes, and even then work does not flag. The first wagon load setting off for the town, threshing in all the barns, the carting of the threshed grain from the barns to the granaries, in the woods the chopping and sawing of timber, the carting of bricks and materials for the building in the spring. Why, I am simply incapable of dealing with it all. Such variety of work. One goes here and there to look, to the mill, to the workyard, and to the factory, and to the threshing floor. You go to have a look at the peasants, too, how they are working for themselves. That's a trifling matter, too, I suppose. But it's a festival for me to see a carpenter using his axe well. I could stand for a couple hours watching him. The work delights me so. And if you see too with what object all this is created, how everything around you is multiplying and multiplying, bringing fruit and revenue, why I can't tell you what a pleasure it is. And not because your money's growing, money is only money, but because it is all the work of your hands, because you can see that you are in a way the cause and creator of it all, and you, like some magician, are scattering abundance and welfare on every side. Where will you find me a delight equal to that? Said Scudrunzolo, and he looked up. All the lines in his face had vanished. He beamed like a triumphant emperor on the day of his coronation. Why, you couldn't find anything so delightful in the whole world. It's in this, just in this, that a man imitates God. God chose for himself the work of creation as the highest delight, and requires the same of man, that he should be the creator of prosperity and the harmonious order of things. And they call that dull work." End quote. Really described that way, it makes a person wish that they could manage a 19th century Russian estate. And while most of us can't do that or anything similar, I know that I enjoy my little garden in a miniature of what he describes. When you have a garden, there's a lot of different things to do. We planned where we were going to put our raised beds. First, we had to measure everything. Then we went and got the wood. We cut it. We screwed it together. We cleared out the grass where we were going to put them. We put them in the ground. We figured out what vegetables we were going to put in which raised bed. Then you got to measure them and plant them. Then you got to water them. Then as they grow, you got to prune them. And then at the end of it all, you get this nice harvest of vegetables, which I'm glad this season we have a good harvest coming in. We have a big old box of tomatoes. We have cucumbers, peppers, eggplants, and we'll probably have a bunch more tomatoes. We've been giving them to our friends. And the vegetables that you grow in your own garden are incomparable to what you can get from the grocery store, not only because it's something that you worked for, you grew it with your hands, but the taste is incomparable. You can smell the cucumber. You can smell the tomato before you bite it. And you can eat a tomato like an apple. You can just like bite into this juicy, delicious tomato that's not too sweet. Anyway, when I read that passage, it made me think of our little garden and how satisfying that is. And in another passage talking about culture, Gogol writes, quote, "Why, that is really strange," said Platonov. "Why is it in Russia that if you don't look sharply after the peasant, he becomes a drunkard and good for nothing from lack of culture?" said Chichikov. "Well, God knows why. Here we are cultured and see how we live. I have been to the university and have listened to lectures on all sorts of subjects, but I did not learn the art and right way of living. And what's more, I did, so to say, learn the art of spending more money on all sorts of new refinements and comforts, and became more familiar with the objects for which money is necessary. Was that because I did not study sensibly? No, my comrades were all the same. 2 or 3 of them perhaps did get real benefit from the lectures, and that was perhaps because they were intelligent anyway. But the others did nothing but try to learn what spoils health and waste money. Yes, indeed, they came to the lectures simply to applaud the professors, to bestow laurels upon them, and not to gain anything from them, so that we take from culture only its worst side. We snatch at the surface of it, but don't take the thing itself." End quote. There he's criticizing culture, or more our approach to it, especially at the university. And that might be a little less true today, though perhaps it's more true, that the people who benefit from lectures are intelligent anyway. But most people go to university and really just learn how to live badly. They learn what spoils health and wastes money. And you might object and say, people can get all kinds of cool degrees at university and learn all kinds of things about math and science and biology and engineering and astronomy and certainly political science, if it's done right. And those people go on to work in those fields and so on. And so I might say perhaps in the past when Gogol was writing, universities were less organized than they are now. Maybe. I might grant that. But at the time, there were certainly people who were learning a given field and then went on to work in that field. So he's also not talking about 100% of students. He's making a generalization. But more importantly, the one thing that is significantly different now than it would have been in his day is both the amount of alcohol that's on a university campus and the amount of extramarital sex, both of which would have been far more scarce at a university in Gogol's day, and both of which, in various ways, spoil health and waste money. And meanwhile, I think most university students are, as Gogol writes, snatching at the surface of culture and knowledge and not taking the thing itself. Those are the passages that I wanted to show you from Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. Despite being unfinished, this is really a wonderful book. I really enjoyed it. It's really an excellent example of social criticism, political satire, and how a novel can be used to take a magnifying glass to society. And one of the things I've been thinking about recently is how time relates to different mediums of art. So for example, if we take music, oil painting, and the novel, 3 different mediums or categories of art. So initially we can look at each of these 3 differently in terms of the time that it takes to relate to them. So an oil painting, you look at an oil painting, and within a few seconds, you've processed at a very basic level what's going on in that painting. Is it a windmill? Is it geometric shapes? Is it a portrait of somebody? But then if you want to look at it more deeply, and if you're a painter and you know how to look at such things, then you can look at the brush strokes and you go, how did he make it look like this? When you look more closely, you can go, oh, he did it like this, or whatever. If you know about different kinds of brushes and using the knife and different techniques and what have you. I clearly don't know anything about this, but my wife does oil painting, and so she knows a lot more, and so I've learned a lot from her about how a painter does what they do, and when we look at a painting, I always benefit a lot from what she has to say about it. And then there's another secondary way you can look at a painting, which is that even if you don't know much about painting, you can still study it more closely, and you might notice things that you didn't notice initially. You might see there's something going on in the background, or if it's a big, complicated Renaissance painting with a lot of drama, there's almost a story going on in a single frame. This guy is stabbing that guy, and this guy is running away or saying something, and it might take a little while to figure that out. But the point is, the time scale on viewing a painting is on average probably a minute or 2. Certainly you can really enjoy a painting sometimes and get lost in it and look at it for longer than that. But it's relatively short, which is ironic because a great oil painting often takes years to produce, though sometimes it's shorter than that. But what's accessible about it is that it has an advantage in a meme form in being processed quickly. You can put a painting on a bag or a notebook and people can look at it quickly for just a second. You can't do that with a novel. Even if you put a page of a novel as kind of an artistic thing, it takes a minute to read a page of a novel, at least. And if you put that on a notebook or a bag, all people are going to see is that it's a page of a novel. They're not going to be able to process what it is. And of course, there's no way to put a symphony on a bag or a notebook. So on the one hand, the oil painting has a disadvantage in that it's processed quickly, but that's also an advantage in a way. Anyway, then you look at a symphony, and there are many symphonies that are 10 to 20 minutes long. Then there are others that are 60 to 90 minutes long. There's a range. And then there's operas that can be 3 or 4 hours, or they can be 2 hours. But so to process a piece of classical music takes a bit longer. To enjoy it, to do what it's meant for, it takes longer than to do what an oil painting is meant for. And then a book, while a poem is shorter, you can read most poems in a minute or 2, though of course there are plenty that are longer than that. A book, depending on what book it is, can take 3 hours to, it's hard to measure, 10 hours, maybe 20 hours, maybe 30 hours if it's a big fat book, or longer even. And because an oil painting is kind of almost instantaneous, whereas these other mediums are gradual in some way, our perception of the second 2 categories is that it's sort of linear. It's a row of things all in a big long line. When you're listening to music, it's a row of seconds. It's a row of moments of music all experienced separately. Or if you're reading a novel, it's a bunch of scenes and dialogues all put next to each other in a row somehow. And that's how we initially think of these things, because that's how we experience them. But looked at it another way, you can think of a piece of music, or maybe it's easier to imagine the second one, a novel, as being a single, integral, monolithic thing, like a big oil painting, but as if you're going over it very carefully, 1 inch at a time. Like we were talking about looking at an oil painting more carefully. You have this initial impression of it, and then you can look at it more carefully, and you can look at the corners in each little bit. If you imagine a novel as being a giant thing like that, but it's so big that you can't look at it all at once. You have to look at it one little section at a time. You're kind of scanning over it very slowly with a magnifying glass. And then you go back to the other side. You go from left to right again, you scan again, and then you go down another 3 inches and you go from left to right again. And by the end, you have this overall picture. I think a good novel gives an impression by the end of it of some larger image. And it can be hard to articulate what that image is, but I think that part of trying to appreciate literature is trying to contemplate that image, and though this part isn't required, to try to articulate it, to try to say what it's about. And Dead Souls, despite being unfinished, you can kind of imagine that it's like an oil painting and the bottom corner or the bottom half of it is unfinished. It definitely gives an overall picture of a person and the people around him and the time that he was living in. If you enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll go over to my website, volrathpublishing.com, and pick up a copy of the edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that I have printed. We have original cover art, 97 footnotes throughout the book that explain some of Mary Shelley's more unusual vocabulary words and historical, literary, geographical references in the book. I have it at a good price, free shipping anywhere in the United States, excellent print quality. And Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is one of those books that I think everybody should read. It's not very long. It has a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. It's relatively fast-paced. It's a good book for somebody. If you are not used to reading old books, it's a great place to start. If you are, it's really required reading anyway. So if you haven't read it, you should get yourself a copy. If you have, you should get a copy for a friend or a family member. It makes an excellent gift. So I hope you'll take this opportunity to support independent publishing. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.